Hello and welcome to today's lesson where we are going to use trig ratios to solve for angle measures. So if you remember our last lesson, we used the trig ratios to find a side length, and now we're going to use trig ratios to find missing angle measures. Okay, so now making sure that your calculator is in degree mode. Number one, that is the most important thing. What we're doing is we're just going to run through these problems really quick to make sure that your calculator is in the proper mode by checking the answers for these. Okay, to get to the sine -1 function, okay, that is a second function with the sine button. Okay, so you want to go second and then sine gets you the sine -1. I type in 0.35 and I get an answer of 20.49 rounded to the nearest hundred. And since these are angle measures, we don't have to have as many decimal places as we do when we're going backwards from the angle to the trig ratio, because the trig ratio is just a solid decimal value. Okay, cosine of -1, so second cosine, and then we type in 45 divided by 57, close the parenthesis, and then hit enter, and we get 37.86. And then tangent -1 of 3/4. Okay, second tangent, 3 divided by 4, close the parenthesis, and we get 36.87 rounded to the nearest hundredth, or 2 decimal place value. Okay, so now, today, like we said, we're going to use the trig ratios that we talked about yesterday, but we're going to use them to find a missing angle measure instead of finding a missing side length. Okay, now, remember, in this case, we're standing at A. So when we stand at A, we have to label our triangle based on that. 16 is the hypotenuse, 8 is the opposite, and then this missing side length would be the adjacent side length. So now, using our trig ratios, okay, using our mnemonic device, okay, SOHCAHTOA, we have an opposite and hypotenuse length. So we have the opposite and hypotenuse, so we're going to use the sine of A equals opposite 8 over hypotenuse, which is 16. Okay, now, in this case, we want sine by itself. So mathematically, we know how we basically get rid of a piece. Okay, we're wanting to get rid of the sine, so we want to divide both sides by sine. Okay, now, there is no divided by sine button on a calculator. So what we have to do is, how do we divide by sine? Okay, we did that in the last screen. We just turn this into a sine -1, okay, because that is a way of talking about a value that's in the denominator of 8 over 16. Okay, so we get A equals sine -1 of 8 over 16. So second sine, 8 divided by 16, or 1/2, equals 30. Okay, so we get A equals 30. Okay, now, find the measurement of angle B. Some of you are probably already saying, I know angle B. If A is 30, then B has to be 60 because it's a 30, 60, 90 triangle. Okay, now let's prove it. Let's prove and see if this makes sense. If I'm standing at angle B, the one I'm trying to prove, 16 is still the hypotenuse, CA is the opposite, and 8 is the adjacent. Notice how it was a little bit different than the last slide. You always have to label the triangle based on where you're standing. So now, SOHCAHTOA, I have an adjacent and a hypotenuse, so I have to use the cosine of B equals the adjacent value over the hypotenuse value. Now I want to get B by itself. So you always want to think about your process. The process would be, mathematically, I would divide both sides by cosine to get b by itself. Okay, and then the last part is there's no dividing by cosine button on your calculator. So that's when we use the cosine -1 and then log in the value that we have. So we do second cosine to get cosine -1, 8 divided by 16, and we get 64 an answer. Okay, so now that's one thing that we want to understand. Why do the answers of A and B together make sense? Because it is a triangle. All triangles add up to 180. So if you know one angle, you can find the missing angle without using trig. Okay, if you use trig to find one, then you can use just basic math to find the other. So when we're trying to find an angle, we have to use the inverse functions, inverse sine, inverse cosine, inverse tangent. Remember mathematically what's happening and what you're thinking about. You're dividing by cosine to get the angle measure by itself. We divide by cosine. Okay, that's mathematically what you want to think about for your process. And the -1, or the inverse functions, are what do that for us. Okay, so remember using inverse trig. Okay, let's look at one more problem here. Solve one more value. We're trying to find theta. They give us a point. And remember, when you're given a coordinate value, what you're given is the x distance and the y distance. Okay, the x distance is the base of that triangle. The y distance is the height. So we have a 90-degree triangle. I'm standing at theta. So if I'm standing at theta, 15 is the opposite, 8 is the adjacent. So then if I'm looking through my trig functions, SOHCAHTOA, okay, O and A is a tangent. So we want the tangent of theta equals the opposite of 15 over the adjacent of 8. Okay, now I'm looking at how can I solve this here. I want the angle measure by itself. Okay, so this is what we always want to think about. We want to think about the fact that we're dividing by tangent to get that angle measure theta by itself, and the calculator can't divide, so we have to use the inverse function to solve this problem for us. So second tangent, tan -1, we plug in the ratio that we know, 15 over 8, and then it finds it for us 61.93 degrees. Okay, and that is how we use trig ratios, sine, cosine, tangent, to find angle measures when we have the side lengths to complete the trig ratio. Thank you, and have a good day.